When you're an innovative business, every blank page is an opportunity. What will you do with it? Will you make something better or create something new? Dell's Technologies Advisors provide you with the tools and expertise to do incredible things because we believe there's an innovator in all of us. To do more with smart tech, find your Dell Technologies Advisor at dell.co.uk/smallbiz. It's the week ending Saturday, the 9th of July, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, agreeing to step down as Conservative leader following a flurry of resignations within his cabinet, a mass shooting at the 4th of July parade in Highland Park, Chicago, and Raheem Sterling leaving Man City to sign for Chelsea FC. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Ollie Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's Digital team is Saoirse Bradley from the Spectator's Chinese Whispers podcast, and in a room with a slightly whirring laptop today, apologies, it's Cindy Yu, and from the Daily History podcast, The Retrospectors, it's Arian McNichol. And Cindy, you're kicking us off today. Just before you do, I've got to ask, how's it been at The Spectator this week? Slow news week?
Yeah, it's been great. In the same way that Boris Johnson said his week was going great on Wednesday at the liaison committee. It's been an incredible couple of days, 72 hours at the time we're recording.
Well, we're going to be talking about lack of sleep later. I imagine that's something that you can readily associate.
Yeah, I've actually got some tips for falling asleep very quickly when you need to.
Oh, go on. Not listening to this, I hope.
No, not at all. There's this kind of lavender spray you can get for your pillow,
yes,
which sends me to sleep. It's very herbal, very fragrant, and I also put on an Audible book.
I use lavender spray pillow mist. You've learned a thing about me. It's my wife's. Now, the Prime Minister is literally about to give his resignation statement as we record this, so you may have to leave us early, Cindy, which is just about understandable. With that said, though, despite all the events of the week in Westminster, our format dictates that I now ask you, what do you think this week should be remembered for?
So, this is the week that the world's largest social media platform went head-to-head with the world's largest democracy.
India is home to 24 million Twitter users, and chances are that number will keep rising. So Twitter wanted to stay in the good books. They wanted to carry on making money in India, until this week at least.
Palki Sharma reporting for India's WION, World is One News, on Wednesday. Cindy, what's the story?
So the Indian government has been increasingly controlling with social media platforms in the country. We know that Narendra Modi's government was never liberal anyway. And last year, when the government came into political troubles with some unpopular policies to do with farming reform, it basically gave an ultimatum to social media platforms to say, you've got to take critical accounts down, even if they're journalists just reporting on the matters. And Twitter at the time wasn't very happy, complied with some of it, didn't comply with the others, and now it has taken the Indian government to court to challenge the stipulations that the government are making on the social media platforms.
On what basis?
Well, I guess on the basis of free speech, right? I mean, the point about Twitter is that you should be able to tweet certain things, and if they're abusive, you can be taken down. But your whole account should not be taken down because of a political problem. There's also a problem that they're opposing, which is that the Indian government is saying that each company needs a compliance officer who will be at risk of imprisonment if the company does not comply, and up to 7 years imprisonment, which is pretty harsh stuff. So Twitter is fighting back on that as well.
Okay, but Arian, those are the laws in India that the supposedly democratically elected government of India have voted for. Who are Twitter to come along as a soon-to-be private San Franciscan company and say you must abide by our principles of freedom of speech?
Well, I suppose from Twitter's perspective, and certainly also from the perspective of activists who argue for free speech, they are a gatekeeper for a way in which people can actually communicate their ideas to the world. And this is ostensibly, at least, something that India has said that it's in favour of. And Twitter itself has spent months locked in a standoff with the government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi over the business of freedom of speech. And it actually all goes quite a lot further back, even prior to this petition before the High Court of Karnataka, this state in southwest India where Twitter has brought its legal action. And it goes back to when people were being critical of the Modi government and its handling, in particular, of the second wave of the coronavirus pandemic in the country last spring. And at that time, India had imposed this really sudden lockdown, which left millions of migrant workers in particular stranded in cities across India with no way to get home. And many hundreds of them then tried to walk home and died of exhaustion or in accidents along the way. And this prompted a crackdown of the government on Twitter, where they asked for people's posts that were being critical of the government and its handling of the coronavirus pandemic to be removed altogether. So Twitter has been involved in this spat with the government for quite a long time.
Yeah. They've been involved in it for a long time, and it was obvious, wasn't it, Saoirse, that it would come to a head like this. I'm going to sort of return to my original question, which is why did they go along with what India were asking for in the first place, if they were always going to then take them to court when it became evident what was always obvious, which was that India was going to try and clamp down on freedom of speech. Twitter should have made a stand earlier, shouldn't they, and said, we don't want to do business here.
Yeah, and the Indian government does have form on banning apps and banning social media platforms. In June 2020, it banned TikTok and other Chinese-made apps. I think it banned about 59 Chinese-made apps. So I think it's definitely something that Twitter could have seen coming. But I think perhaps the argument is, while there have been fears over kind of how TikTok and other Chinese apps use their data, particularly at a time where there has been kind of clashes along the border with India and China. In many ways, that ban has been seen as sort of understandable, whereas these orders that the Indian government has been placing on Twitter has essentially been clamping down on legitimate expressions of freedom of speech, cracking down on journalists and news outlets and magazines. So there is much more kind of a concern about freedom of speech and freedom of expression here.
I guess ultimately, though, Cindy, it comes down to who needs each other more, doesn't it? Does India need Twitter more than Twitter needs India? That's really what this is going to come down to, because it's sort of a financial relationship, really, for Twitter.
Yeah, absolutely. There are 24 million Twitter users in India, and obviously India is a massive country, so that could be even greater as a market to tap into. Whereas Indian government ministers have been promoting their own social media platforms. There's one called Coup, which the Financial Times describes as a patriotic alternative to Twitter. So I guess everyone's coming up with it.
Not
Yeah,
COUP, surely. That doesn't sound like something Modi would be a fan of.
It's KOO, which maybe means something.
Okay.
But yes, it's KOO. But, I'm particularly interested in this story because that's the kind of thing that China and Russia do. In particular in China, you have all of these parallel social media apps because the Chinese government doesn't want its users to use what's internationally available uncensored. I just think it's incredible that, as the world's largest democracy, what we're seeing is a divergence between liberalism and democracy, I think, in India, which is that, yes, the government is democratically elected, yes, it has a majority rule, but it is far from liberal. It is not what we expect from a liberal democracy. And so, even though we use those two words almost interchangeably, they really don't have to come hand in hand at all. And that's what we're seeing playing out in India. And I think we should keep an eye on it because we do want India to be a Western ally in geopolitical sense. The Russian invasion has shown that that's not so easy, with India taking a more than apologist line probably for the Russians. But also, in future, people will want to have India on side for any balance of power against China. But I just think we need to keep an eye on what's going on inside these countries.
So for you then, Cindy, choosing this story, is it more about Twitter or is it more about India? Because Twitter are taking the action, aren't they? It's a story about Twitter's corporate governance, but really this for you is about what's happening in India. I think,
yes, marginally more about what's happening in India. I think people don't talk enough about the persecution of the Muslim minority in India that's happening very legally because of the changes in law under Modi. At the same time, though, Twitter is a very interesting story because last time I was on the programme, we talked about the online safety bill, the way that Twitter is trying to satisfy various international governments all around, with Elon Musk taking it over later this year, possibly. We'll wait to see what his attitude is to national laws. But I think that's also an interesting topic because it's about a multinational corporation going up against a democratically elected government and their multiple definitions of free speech.
Arian.
Yeah, and I think that deterioration of both political and civil liberties in India is hugely important, not only, as Cindy was saying, because of the attacks on Muslims that we don't see covered nearly enough over here, but also on, the pressure on human rights organizations, intimidation of journalists and activists generally. This is all together contributory to the fact that recently Freedom House, in its report Democracy Under Siege, now describes India as only partly free, as opposed to completely free, which it used to be. And I think that's a hugely important thing when we're thinking about the global shift in the balance between democracy and authoritarianism. And I think that, we regularly hear the names of Trump and Orban mentioned, and obviously Putin, in thinking about that sort of encroachment of authoritarianism across the globe. But somehow Modi often slips off the radar, and he is a huge and contributing part to the story, especially because he presides over what is meant to be the world's biggest democracy.
But there are lots of business links, aren't there, between Britain and India, partly obviously because of the large Indian population here, Saoirse. I don't feel like we're hearing the same thing that you hear about China, for example, where people are like, you know what, I'd think twice before going out there to do business at all. I'm not sure that these restrictions impact people on a daily basis in our neck of the woods.
I think the problem is that it will soon affect people's perception of India and how easy it is to do business there. I think obviously on the world stage, any government who is continuously changing its laws and changing rules, especially to do with, large multinational companies, then it no longer seems like an attractive place to do business. And that could soon have certainly a large effect on what social media platforms choose to do in India and whether they choose to set up business in India. And that has, huge knock-on effects for people who live there if they can't kind of communicate how they wish to, not just with their own friends and family, but with the rest of the world.
Okay, so that's the India side of it. On the Twitter side of it, Cindy, we're in a bit of a difficult position, aren't we, where one social media company appears to have such a stranglehold over news that the government can intervene there and stop news being published these days. That's a problem.
Yeah, it probably is a problem. There's too much power given to one company, and it's a problem that we've seen all over the world. We've seen it in the UK, we've seen it in the US, where Twitter can ban a former president of the United States, and then we won't see or hear anything from him on that platform, which is where a lot of people get their news from.
And therefore in the mainstream media, effectively.
Right, I don't really know what to say. I mean, we're talking about Boris Johnson today. I mean, so many people, journalists and the public, are getting their news from Twitter because that is the fastest, most concise way you're going to get your news these days. I'm not sure what the solution is, because fundamentally, Twitter has succeeded because it's user-friendly, people like using it, it's free, it works for people. So I think in that sense, it's cornered a market quite legitimately, but I'm not really sure what the solution is if it has done that because it provides a good service.
And given that power that Twitter has, I think it's really significant that they are actually complying with the government of India's determinations on what they can and can't do. Because if they can't stand up to the Indian government, then how can both organizations with India or even individuals hope to stand up to these rules? If a company as powerful as Twitter can't do anything about this, then who can hope to do something about it within India?
Okay. Cindy, we've got to let you go off the pod now because I understand there's some breaking news in Borisland. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay. Arian, you're up next after this. When you're an innovative business, every blank page is an opportunity. What will you do with it? Will you make something better or create something new? Dell's Technologies Advisors provide you with the tools and expertise to do incredible things because we believe there's an innovator in all of us. To do more with smart tech, find your Dell Technologies Advisor at dell.co.uk/smallbiz. Arian, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we learned that we're sleepwalking into an epidemic of sleeplessness.
I have a friend who yells fire just to rouse her sleeping teen, and another who got so fed up that she had to dump cold water on her son's head just to get him out of bed. Sound brutal? But perhaps familiar? Every morning I ask myself, how can I, knowing what I know and doing what I do for a living, be doing this to my own son?
Wendy Troxell's TED Talk, Why School Should Start Later for Teens, from back in 2017. You can watch the whole thing online, describing there some pretty horrendous ways to wake up teenage kids. But Arian, it needn't be that way.
So, help is coming to Troxell in the form of a new law in California, which went into effect this week, that delays school start times, basically requiring that public high schools should start at or after 8:30 a.m., which is about half an hour later than the US average, and for middle school students to start at 8 a.m. or later. And the result of all of this will effectively be that teens get to sleep in more. And it's important kind of for two reasons. A, because it's the first law of its kind in the US and may come to be emulated elsewhere across the country. And B, because sleep experts say that it's a big step towards addressing the common problem of sleep deprivation, which in the US is now so endemic that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, have declared it to be a public health epidemic.
Yeah, and this wasn't a new story to me, Saoirse, in the sense that I read frequently that teenagers need more sleep and that school times should be shunted forwards in the UK. Now, every year you get that story, don't you? But it never actually happens. It's quite impressive, isn't it, that California have passed a law allowing it to happen?
Oh, definitely. And I think it's something we should probably emulate here in the UK. I remember when I was at school, that was definitely something that was discussed, staggered start times
Yeah.
for different age groups. And I don't really know what ever kind of came of that. I think everyone remembers being a teenager and trying to drag yourself up for school. I mean, even now, and, trying to get into work at 8 a.m. is painful. And I definitely don't need as much sleep as I did when I was a teenager or when any of us were teenagers. So yeah, bring it in, bring it on. I think that's what British school children need as well.
I suppose it's more extreme in the first place, isn't it, though, Arian? I mean, what is it with America asking their children to start school at 7 in the morning anyway? I mean, that's just, I know that the whole country starts work earlier than Europe, but that is insane.
That does seem particularly intense, and it's got to be contributing to what Columbia University researchers in a recent paper called, particularly for teenagers, the Great Sleep Recession. You know, it is the fact that getting kids out of bed in the way that Wendy Troxell was describing in her TED Talk is very, very hard. And it's because we know that teens need more sleep than adults to be functional. But it's a problem that's actually affecting adults too. Adults apparently need between 7 and 9 hours sleep per night. But according to some of the studies that came out in conjunction with this latest legal change in the States, 35% of Americans report sleeping much less than that. And it's even worse over here in the UK, where only a quarter of adults get enough sleep. So this is a broad problem that is affecting teens. And there is a specific solution that California has come up with to address the problem for teenagers. But it's also a problem that's being experienced around the world and for all age groups.
I was going to say, I think it's interesting to note that it seems to be a relatively new phenomenon. There's polling data that suggests only 11% of us were sleeping 6 hours or less per night in 1942. But by 1990, that figure was 42%. So it does seem over the past few decades, we're getting increasingly less and less sleep. And, the reasons for that are probably longer working hours. We're commuting longer distances. We're probably getting a lot less sunlight, working, more hours in offices with more increasing number of people who have office jobs. And that all kind of affects our sleep and stress levels as well.
I did actually see a paper in the Journal of Sleep Research that was titled Sleep Differences in the UK between 1974 and 2015. Total page turner, that one. Definitely not something likely to send you to sleep. But that actually debunked this idea that at least between the 70s and now, our sleep patterns are changing very much. They said that quite a lot of the suggestions that people today are getting dramatically less sleep on the basis of particularly tech development, are a bit overstated due to studies that are being done in the US. But anytime you extend those around the world, actually it looks as though people's sleep patterns have been relatively static since at least at sort of the middle of last century. But what's important, and why the epidemic is still, I think, an appropriate word to this story, is that I think what's changing is our realization that sleep is hugely important. And I think that the most significant stuff that we're discovering at the moment is the impact that it has on individuals, and the fact that we need to do something, including things like legislate, to ensure that we get more sleep as a society.
What is that impact, Saoirse? What does it do to you to not have enough sleep?
Well, quite terrible things, really. It increases your risk for diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, obesity, death, and it also causes us a lot of emotional suffering. It raises our anxiety levels. And in one article I was reading in Vox, there's even the suggestion that sleep is an equality issue as well. People who are from low income backgrounds or in racial minorities on the whole get less sleep, and therefore are more greatly affected by health issues that come with lack of sleep. And on a societal level, it actually it can have societal effects as well, because some research shows that we can behave less ethically when we haven't slept enough. I think that seems kind of obvious. If you're grumpy, then you act more selfishly.
I can attest to that as a person with a young baby, that my wife and I are not at our most ethical at the moment. We're definitely grumpier individuals than we normally are, and less giving.
And it's not really the done thing to mention that at work, is it? Although you just have, Arian.
Yes, true.
There's kind of maybe a macho culture around not sleeping within capitalism generally since the 1980s, isn't there? Where it's seen as a bit lazy if you talk about lying in. Certainly, not checking your emails in the evening because that's your downtime can be seen as self-indulgent in a corporate
Right.
setting.
Yeah, I mean, Margaret Thatcher famously ran the country on 4 hours sleep per night, and Donald Trump at one point proudly boasted that he only slept for 3 hours.
Both of them highly ethical individuals at all times.
Yeah, right. That goes to the ethical point. He asked on the campaign trail, how does somebody that's sleeping 12 to 14 hours a day compete with someone who's sleeping 3 or 4? But I think that idea that sleeping an adequate amount equates to laziness is hugely prevalent in our kind of contemporary conception of how we're meant to be as workers in particular, that we're meant to sort of shun sleep in favor of doing more work. And I think that is problematic and contributory to what's going on here.
And I also think there's probably an element of, maybe after the pandemic, but maybe also just, in the last kind of few decades of constant economic shocks, there's a cultural shift in how we look at sleep and wealth. We used to look at Donald Trump, for example, and he said, I get 3 hours of sleep a night, and that's how I, get ahead and get my deals done and have become president, etc. Margaret Thatcher said she only used to get 4 hours sleep a night. And now I think there's a greater cultural shift towards a wellness culture, and that wellness culture and being able to participate in that wellness culture is also sort of signifies wealth. That if you have enough time to slow down, and there's this idea on kind of TikTok and social media of like living the soft life, not always being at work, not always being on the go, but doing yoga, traveling, kind of following your pleasure, inverted commas, whatever that means, then that is more associated with wealth in a kind of greater social status now than you being at work all the time and getting the business deals done. I think perhaps now why we're starting to consider sleep as increasingly important is because we actually value that kind of life and that having time to ourselves much more now than we have in the past.
Suddenly it makes sense why this law came out of California, the way you've just contextualized it. I mean, do you think, Arian, this is something that is going to go elsewhere? Do you think that we're going to start having sleep awareness courses in schools? Was one of the suggestions I saw a commentator make in one of these articles, a bit like sex ed.
Yes, already New York and New Jersey are considering similar legislation to California in, pushing back school start time. So that's a shift that could well go through fairly quickly. And then the sorts of things that you're talking about introducing education in school to show children the importance of sleep. But I think one of the problems, especially with the way that sleep deprivation is being tackled at a broad level, as Saoirse was saying, is that it's often very individualized. We have devices that track our own sleep, and then we're given drugs to help on an individual level, when in fact you do need these sort of broad kind of legislative based solutions. Or even I saw one good idea to create a kind of visual metaphor like the food pyramid, which we all have in our minds, that tells us about, the percentage of grains and vegetables that we should eat versus chocolate and fatty foods. But, we need something similar that shows us in a really clear way what good sleep patterns look like, so that when we lay our heads down at night, we have that in the back of our minds going, this is what I should be aiming for.
There is an element of personal responsibility when it comes to teenagers as well, though, isn't it? God, I sound like my dad already. But Saoirse, I mean, we're going to be talking, spoiler, in the next story, a little bit about our reliance on smartphone technology. With teenagers in particular, I mean, when you're talking about 16, 17, 18-year-olds, a lot of those people are going to be going to bed late because they're up on their tablets and phones, talking to each other, playing games, looking at porn, watching music videos. And that's part of the problem.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes that is a lesson to learn through, I don't want to say suffering, but through lack of sleep. I think as we have all learned, if you spend hours scrolling on Instagram or Twitter and don't go to bed till 1 or 2 in the morning, then you're going to feel terrible in the morning. And unfortunately, kind of that's one of life's lessons. And I don't think there's much you can do with kind of trying to get teenagers off their phone. Now I sound about 8,000 years old, but we're trying to get teenagers off their phones because their whole life and their whole social circle is on there. So it's kind of just got to be learned the hard way, I think, really.
Yeah.
And because the apps are designed to keep you there. Keep that thought in your mind for our next story, which is coming up after this. Okay, Saoirse, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Was this the week that... Oh, I can't remember.
What's my day look like?
Another busy day today.
Are you serious?
Yes, I'm not allowed to be frivolous.
Okay. Move my 4 o'clock today to tomorrow. Change my 11 a.m. to 2.
Okay, Marty, I scheduled it for today.
Is that Rick? Where's Rick?
Here's Rick.
Oh, no, it's not Rick. Now, how's the traffic headed downtown?
Here's the traffic.
Oh, it's terrible. Terrible. Driver, cut across.
An Apple commercial from 2012 featuring Martin Scorsese using Siri. I missed the iPhone 4S. Saoirse, what's the story?
Well, as I and every other person in the media scrolled Twitter for 8 or 9 hours yesterday, waiting for the next resignation, it reminded me of a really interesting article I read in The Guardian this week by Rebecca Seal. And her article explored the effects that our constant access to smartphones, gadgets, and the internet could be having on our memories. So the article asks if we're at risk of suffering from digital amnesia or even dementia due to our reliance on smartphones, digital calendars, our notes app, GPS, in order to navigate our everyday lives. And
okay, so the theory behind this is because you no longer have to remember a phone number when you call your uncle, that could bring on dementia. I mean, that's basically what she's arguing, right?
Well, sort of. Neuroscientists are really divided on this issue. And I have to say, having read the article, although it's incredibly interesting, there's not that much data to back up various claims made yet. But it's still an interesting idea to explore nonetheless. Some scientists argue we've essentially always sort of offloaded our memories onto external devices because simply writing down notes or using a diary is, that's us offloading our memories. While others argue the less we use sort of the complex memory systems in our brains, the greater risk we are at of dementia because we're not using our episodic memory, essentially.
that's interesting, isn't it, Arian? Because I think we can all relate to this idea. If you grew up as you and I did in the 1980s, you can remember the change from when you used to recall lots of trivia to now just remembering a faint bit of it, and you Google it and there's the answer. But at the same time, as Saoirse said, when scribes first started writing down the Bible, that was offloading oral tradition onto text. I mean, it's just something that humans do so that we can use our brains for other things.
Yes, within the Guardian article, a chap called Professor Oliver Hart is quoted, and he studies neurobiology of memory and forgetting at McGill University in Montreal. And he gave the example of GPS, which is obviously a technology that has saved so many people, myself included. I just feel like it's one of the best things that has been come up with in my lifetime, because map reading used to be so hard. But what Hart says is that actually it's important to do things with your brain that are hard, because when you stop doing them, your brain loses capacity. So at least for him, and he falls into the camp of people who are saying that we need to continue stressing our brains, doing things are difficult, applying our memories and our cognitive function so as to beat off the potential threats of brain deprivation. We have to keep doing that, because otherwise we're going to get ourselves into a lot of trouble. So things like GPS, convenient as they are potentially problematic for our sort of broad mental futures.
Well, also what the article went into, Saoirse, which I found interesting and relates to our last story, is it's not just about outsourcing your memory and relying on machines to do that. It's that the machines are now programmed in a way to send you what they call notifications, but are actually distractions that stop you from being able to focus on the thing you're supposed to be using them for. So it's gone beyond the practical use scenario and into a place where we're being dictated to by the software engineering.
Yeah, and I think that's also something that can be potentially, I think we're all slowly realizing can be really damaging if our attention is always, taken away from our task. How are we really supposed to get any work done? How are we supposed to spend time doing the things that are important to us?
Even if we've had 8 hours sleep.
Even if we've had 8 hours sleep. And I think another interesting thing that was brought up in the article was what it means for our ability to, I think they phrase it as, think deep and interesting thoughts, and essentially be insightful and think complexly. And if we never spend, more than 5 seconds thinking about a task, or more than 5 seconds reading an article or reading a book, then we kind of lose that ability to put pieces of information together, think about it on a deeper level, come up with our own opinions, etc. And you can easily see how that kind of leads to perhaps the dumbing down of society or kind of wider public discourse, and how that could be really negative. So I think that is definitely something we should be considering.
And also the way that notifications and texts simply take you out of the moment. There was one example that was given of, sitting around watching a lovely sunset, but having the constant onslaught of notifications coming into your phone, meaning that you don't, A, look at that experience properly, and B, then internalize it and memorize it and take it with you in a way that could potentially be, they were suggesting, harmful to our ability to be even creative, let alone have memories of the moment. And we probably all have, experience of this in looking through our phones and coming to remember experiences that we've had via the photos we've got, rather than the actual recollection that we, used to have via our own eyes. And instead we are now looking back on things that we have done only through the version of it that lives in our phones. And I think that is at least a little bit concerning, at least conceptually.
Yeah. But I mean, again, there's an element of autonomy, isn't there? We actually aren't machines. We could put our phones in drawers if we didn't want to use them anymore. And that's the thread running through this episode of the show, weirdly, isn't it, Saoirse? Thinking back to what Cindy was saying, where she was like, well, I can't think what the solution is, but everyone does rely on Twitter for news. The solution is don't use it, but we're all using it. So, I mean, it's kind of like, we know what the answer is, but we don't want to. We like using these devices. That's the problem.
Yeah, exactly. I think maybe part of it is we like to, as humans, think of ourselves as higher beings, the apex species. But at the same time, we are essentially still at the most base level animals. And I think kind of what constant notifications and apps do, and our attention constantly being drawn somewhere else, that is essentially part of our human nature. And that's what Professor Oliver Hart has argued, who studies neurobiology at McGill University.
Which I'm sure you had straight off the top of your memory, right?
And yeah, not on notes on my phone. Yeah.
You've already forgotten that I introduced him just 2 minutes ago.
Exactly. There you go, proving what we're discussing.
But that's the thing, isn't it? That yes, on a personal basis, each individual human may no longer have, if this is true, may no longer have the same memories or even folk memories of things that they'd learned through their lives to share with other humans. But what we all have access to democratically is a greater understanding of all human knowledge ever at the touch of a fingerprint, right? I mean, anyone, not just a member of the British Library, can now log on to Wikipedia and find out about stuff they're interested in pretty impressive detail quickly. I mean, isn't it worth it?
I think it's so worth it. I mean, personally, you think about the impact that even, prior to computers or mobile phones, when we just had calculators, you no longer had to be able to do complex mathematics because you had this device that could do it all for you. So I sort of, even at the time, I remember thinking that's a good outsourcing of that particular thing, which is quite difficult, but I can do it with this device incredibly quickly. And I think the same thing about a lot of the tasks that phones and computers offer to help with. It's useful for me to no longer have to store such an enormous amount of knowledge about, say, directors of films or scorers of goals in World Cups in my brain, because I can now look them up. In the moment of having the conversation, you can kind of find the information you need. Yes, it takes away some of the fun of a debate at, I don't know, a dinner party or whatever that used to be able to be factually based, where you just had to agree to disagree because you didn't have the information unless you stood up and got out at, I don't know.
Oh, that's a terrifying vision of the future, isn't it? Sorry, I can't discuss this. We're just going to have to ask the smart speaker what she thinks.
Exactly.
Because that's the right answer.
But no, it is different now. You can actually sort out those factual disagreements quite instantly. But it comes to, it brings us to a different kind of communication. And arguably, sometimes I would say that's better.
And I can, you would hope essentially this ability for society and the world as a whole to have this collective historical memory could only be a good thing and can only hopefully lead us forward to a more equal society, etc., etc. But then, that at the same time, relying on technology, relying on computers, the smartphones and the internet, to keep that collective historical record, that comes with its own host of issues, because that technology one day is defunct, and it's how we keep that kind of historical collective memory going, I think, is like the next big question, isn't it? That could be a whole other topic on this podcast, I think.
Definitely.
And I guess another solution to how to enable us to focus on things is to use technology. I mean, that always seems deeply ironic to me when, Silicon Valley companies are coming up with other alternative apps that we can use to restrict the use of the apps we're addicted to.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's kind of what they recommend, isn't it? They say set an alarm on your phone and you don't look at your phone until the alarm goes off.
Yes, an academic called Larry Rosen advocates exactly that. He talks about tech breaks, which we, do in our own lives by exactly what you've said, setting a timer for 15 minutes and then placing our phone just out of reach and not allowing ourselves to go back and look at the phone until the alarm goes off, and then gradually increasing the time between alarms so that ultimately you get to days where you have hour-long or 2-hour-long breaks between looking at your device. And it seems so simple, but it's an absurd thing that it's a tech-based solution to a tech-based problem. But I suppose it's also dependent on what you were saying earlier, which is our individual capacity to regulate ourselves. And I think that is important, that we have to have some agency here.
And also our choice. Like, do we have a choice? Because what are we looking at in that 15 minutes when we're not looking at our phones? We're probably, in my case, I would be looking at an iMac screen, which is also connected to my iMessages,
Right. Yeah.
my FaceTime, and the whole suite of Apple products. I'm then using a Google browser, which is connected to all of my Gmail notifications. So even if I haven't got my phone there, I'm likely to be distracted at some point in that 15 minutes. And I am using a computer.
Just take your computer, Ollie, and throw it in the ocean. That's the only solution.
Well, a reminder has just gone off on my phone to tell me to end the show. So my thanks to you, Arian, and Saoirse for your stories, and to Cindy earlier as well. You can follow this show for free. That's a good thing you can do with your phone right now and get every episode as soon as it's released just by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tapping follow. Remember, too, to check out our sister show from the week, The Overview. I've been Ollie Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.